Okay. We sort of put a map together of how we're hoping the conversation will go. And Jim, you shared it with these all.
I think I did. I think I sent some questions and areas of. Did I do that? I think so. Yeah.
You sure did, and it's great. And it starts out with just asking how COVID. I mean, I'm personally really interested in is if it affected the plays that were submitted for the ONeill Center, how's it's affected students of theater and your training and how that's gone about, and then also development, right? Because Laura, that's sort of your bailiwick is development and audiences and stuff. So from all of your professional perspectives, because you're coming at it the same thing from different places, it would be interesting to hear how you feel this has informed your work.
Yeah. Well, at the ONeill, I have discovered what everybody did during the pandemic. They wrote a play or a musical. And then they submitted it.
Positive, isn't it?
Yeah. And then they submitted it to the ONeill. I think we had something like a 30% increase in submissions this year from previous years. So it has been, I think it was a surprise to all of us. And we are really trying to make it through scripts as quickly. And we have 2 fewer slots this season because trying to get back up from COVID is taking us a little bit longer. So it's more competitive than it was in previous years. But it's really, I mean, it's a very interesting, really high quality set of new pieces that have come through, which is sort of amazing. And we've gotten really great feedback from our readers. I think we had 1,500 plays and 350 musicals. So it's been kind of a mad dash to get them, in the hands of readers. And we're finally, I think, down to semifinalists on plays. We're on second round for musicals, and really just trying to keep our head above water and make sure that we can present something this summer before, hopefully everything stays on a good path. And because I think people are really excited to be back in a rehearsal room together, not just on Zoom, but get to sort of create as a team, which has not been something that people have been has been easy for many people to do.
Yeah, I missed that.
Yeah.
How about you, Tom?
So we've, in the higher ed sphere, we've had it's obviously been challenging, and it's certainly changed what we produce and how we produce it. So I was the first member of our faculty to direct a fully produced, fully staged show during the pandemic, which was last May is when we opened. So we cast it in January, started rehearsals in March. It was the only thing I did in person all year last year. I taught all of my classes entirely online, but from March through the beginning of May, I was in a rehearsal studio for a show that was going to be staged outdoors in masks with handheld mics, not body mics, because we didn't feel comfortable miking anybody, and actors not able to get within 6 feet of each other, which is a very interesting set of circumstances to stage a musical that actually have with story and staging and acting, and not just a concert. We had done concerts. We wanted to have choreography. And so it was a really challenging experience. I was absolutely terrified walking into that room for the first time, going, 1, I hope nobody gets sick. 2, I don't know how to do this. Like every trick that I have in my bag as a director, I was like, I don't think I can use that trick right now. Starting with, I really like hiding my directorial flaws with good lighting. And when you're working outside and you don't have design, but sorry, Jim, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. How did that inform the choice of play? I mean, did you want to do what you wanted to do?
It very much informed it, because we had to completely change our season on the fly. We had approved a season that we were planning to do because we approved it in December of 2019 to start in the fall of 2020. And then everything changed. The show I was originally slated to do, it was the musical Violet by Janine Tesori, which is a show that I adore. And I decided I didn't really want to do a show about healing when we were in the middle of a pandemic and when people couldn't touch each other.
Yeah.
So we started looking for new scripts, and we kicked a lot around, and we were looking for something because we were making this decision in June for the following year. And we needed something that could work in a completely normal theater scenario in case maybe we were back there, or could work outdoors, or could work on film. We didn't know, but we knew we had to pick a show because we had to start designing fairly soon. It was also a conversation that was happening in the midst of the resurgent conversation around Black Lives Matter. And we realized that my department in its history had never done a musical by a Black playwright.
Wow.
And we said that is bad and we shouldn't keep that going. And we found a musical called Pete Her Pan by Doug Lyons, who was the writer of Chicken and Biscuits, which was just on Broadway this fall. It's a children's musical. It's cute. The music is great. It's 65 minutes long, which was a real plus.
Oh, yeah.
And because it was so based in imagination and play, I went, I can stylize this in as many directions as I have to, because the central conceit of the show buys me a bunch. So that's what I ended up doing.
Bravo. And Laura.
Oh, Lord. And Taylor, it's been a journey. I think like every company, we were busier than we've ever been in March of 2020. There was a lot happening, and overnight it came to a screeching halt. So we shut our doors on March 13th, I believe, March 12th. And we were closed to the public for 600 days. We reopened publicly with a production of Rent in November of this year, which was a whole roller coaster. But in the time of the shutdown, in the time where you couldn't do live theater, we turned to film. So we're lucky in that we have our largest performance space is essentially a large black box. Everything can come in and out and be configured how you want it. So they took out all of the audience seating and turned the theater into a film studio. And we shot 5 feature-length films of theatrical productions last year. And this was, in that pandemic utopian world where under a SAG contract with extremely stringent safety protocols, and it was banana pants. We had an on-site medic. We were doing, the deepest of deepest nasal swabs in a bathroom where I asked, how far up my nose do you go? And they pointed here. And I'm like, how'd you get all the way down there? Where'd you make a left turn? So, we had medics on site. We had, PCR testing 3 times a week in a bathroom. We had, catering for every meal break because we didn't want people to go outside. We had different entrances for different classifications of employment. And, my office was in a zone that I wasn't any class of anymore. So I had to move, and work in a lobby for a year. It was wild, but it was cool. And the programming that came out of that was eclectic, but, it ranged from a one-man show by Daniel J. Watts about his life to we did a musical of After Midnight starring Christopher Jackson and everything in between. So that was kind of, and then we dipped our toe in the water with a big outdoor concert at Wolf Trap, which is a big performance venue. So that was kind of how we filled the shutdown. But flashing forward to today's world, we reopened with this big production of Rent, and it was this euphoric return of coming back to live theater, and it was
My
the
favorite.
highest of highs, and we made it out alive, and it was just so celebratory. And that was in November, and then come December, we got hit pretty hard with Omicron, and what started as one positive case on Thursday turned into a lot more than one positive cases by the end of the weekend. And we had to shut down, and there we were again. It felt like very triggering and familiar, and protocols were adapting rapidly, and there were, a lot of people sick, and we didn't know if the production was going to come back. It was one of those situations again where it's, we were going strong, and then the rug got ripped underneath us. But we made it back, which was great. And there was something special in the last, when we came back from the shutdown in December, it was January at this point, we had like a week and a half left of performances, and it was this really precious energy with every performance that, it was the peak of the Omicron surge, and our safety protocols were incredibly stringent, but everyone kind of played each performance as if it could be the last, because we could come back on the next day of testing and we'd be done. So the energy was pretty electric in the last kind of week and a half of coming back, which was really special. So yeah, I mean, now we're at a point, we are kind of the busiest, our company's the busiest it's been since the shutdown. We have 2 shows running. One is about to go into tech, one is in performances, and new play developments and readings and workshops and everything in between. So but that, kind of resetting the pace, recalibrating what that means to be doing that in this climate is kind of an ever evolving target and set of protocols. So we're adapting as it goes, and really taking the time to listen to what the artists need in this moment. What felt normal and what worked then. People are saying, I'm uncomfortable with this. And, we need to push pause and listen and kind of respond and figure out how to meet everyone with where they are right now.
What's the anxiety level about the future? I mean, are you, it feels like you guys have come up with these amazing strategies for, meeting the challenge. What about, have audiences fallen off? What about the financial picture of your institutions? What's the future that you think of?
On our side, it has been incredibly financially challenging. I mean, if it weren't for government help and intervention, I think it would have been very hard to open our doors at all. Although we don't, most of our earned revenue doesn't come from ticket sales. It mainly comes from tuition for our conservatory program. The one thing that we were able to keep going were our classes, but we had to do it by creating a bubble. And so the things that these students dealt with for their 2 semesters of being masked and having to quarantine for weeks on end, and taking classes via Zoom and being tested twice a week. And if someone came up positive, everybody ended up on lockdown in their various dorm room, and, having meals delivered to their rooms and cottages, and fighting over who gets to use the vacuum cleaner today. I mean, it was just everything that you could possibly think of that they put up with. And then when we got to the summer and were able to do some outdoor programming, not our normal programming, we also had union issues where we couldn't have actors in rehearsal rooms. So we mostly did our work with actors over Zoom. I guess my question is, we've all sort of been in this together, and everyone's been very forgiving. Some of my concern is, how much grace are we going to have as we try to put all the pieces back together? How much space are we going to have to mess up, or to, maybe not be able to make as much money as we normally do? because it's, I'm certainly watching it happen on Broadway. It seems like shows that you thought would be able to stick around can't make it, but they've also not really had, it was like they had to hit the ground running and be perfect from day one. And there's not enough energy, money, audience, to just sort of have that sort of grace period. So that's one of the concerns I definitely have.
That's really valid. I think the desire that we all be in the room together to hear the stories again, and one would hope that it would, that we'd all become a little scrappier, perhaps. But I think that involves also educating the audiences in a way to get the audiences to appreciate stripped down, or and hopefully that becomes the mother of invention. But I love that you said precious energy, Laura, because that's what it really feels like when you're really in the room with the work of art. And going back to the theater, that's been a really exciting thing. But hearing from you, Tiffany, about, it's so true. It's like, where are we going to go from here?
Right.
Yeah.
And
it's been fun to be an audience member again. That I've really enjoyed. I mean, I've loved being able to go to the theater and just get to see. I feel like I appreciate theater in a way I haven't in a long time. So.
And that's interesting to me. I have not had much of an opportunity to be back in a theater yet as an audience. I live in Central Illinois, not in a city, and not in a community with particularly high vaccination rates. So other than pretty much things I go to for work, shows that my students are doing, I haven't yet had the experience of being back in a real professional theater audience, and I miss it really badly. But I haven't been able to travel to go to one of the places where I feel like it's being done safely. But if you try to tell people in an audience here that they have to wear a mask, it's just not going to happen.
I worry about audiences kind of not giving up. I don't mean that, but I had lunch with a friend recently, and she said that she went back. She's been going back to concerts and theater, and she thought she was doing fine not doing those things. She thought, she had Netflix, she had Medici TV, she had all this stuff, and she was watching a lot, and she thought, this is okay. I can. And then she started going back, and she said, I just was overwhelmed by what it meant to be in a space, watching people sing or act. But I wonder, there's no answer to this, but I wonder for other people if there's going to be an acceptance of a new normal. Audiences don't feel the need to come back. I'm talking about the orchestra too, not just
It's interesting in terms of the trend we're seeing this year for ticket sales. My company, we have two major performance spaces. Neither of them are particularly large. The largest space at most can seat 300. And so prior to the pandemic, it wasn't uncommon that shows and full runs would sell out within the first, 2 or 3 weeks. But we're noticing that the sales are trending kind of much closer to the performance. The advanced planning you're not seeing. So you may look at the last, 3 weeks of a run, and the houses look completely empty a month before we get to that time, but it filled up in the last days. So we're seeing a lot more. Theaters are needing to be more flexible with exchanges and returns to kind of meet the needs of the audiences. But in terms of sales and where they're trending, they're kind of coming in last minute.
No, go ahead, Tom.
Jim, you asked about essentially, are people going to come back? And Terry has heard me on this particular soapbox before, because early in the pandemic, I popped into her class and gave this talk that I was kind of doing a bunch of places. I started I'm a theater historian. That I have a PhD in theater history, so that's where my training is. And I did this talk first for my students, and then I started doing it for alums, and then I started doing it for anybody who was interested, which is just looking at the history of the theater and how it always comes back. And I have no reason to believe that this is going to be different. Mm-hmm. Every single time there's been one of these shutdowns historically, and they've happened so many times. Every time it happens, it does come back. It usually comes back different. Mm-hmm. Hopefully in this instance, it comes back better. But it also doesn't come back immediately. It's not a light switch. Mm-hmm. And so I take a lot of long-term hope from just looking historically since theater first started being documented, of all of these times that something threatened it, and it's like, no, here I am, still here, over here, just doing my thing. I have a lot of confidence that we're going to return. And you mentioned the orchestra. Music has faced all of these same things. They're all forms of live artistic performance. It's going to come back. It's just a question of how long is it going to take, and how many people are going to have been lost from the field on the way. Mm-hmm. How many people are going to have said, I can't stay in this anymore. I have to pay my bills.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. Laura, what went into deciding that Rent was going to be your first show back?
Yes, what was that decision?
Here's the funniest part, and this almost never happens. That was actually the show. We had the rights to that show since the end of 2019. And it was slated to be in that exact same time frame. And so we almost always, adapt and book shows out 2 years in advance and then move when they happen. Somewhat serendipitously, we just kind of stuck with the plan in a time where there was never a plan that anyone could ever stick to. But I think in terms of what solidified the decision to do it, there's a lot of themes that are relevant to today's climate. The idea of looking at a year of life and a year of loss, and the parallels to the AIDS epidemic of the 90s with today's, COVID pandemic, the kind of rise of the very theme of the title of the show with, artists being forced out of housing due to lack of funding to pay their rent because their artistry and their art form has gone away. So there was a lot of kind of elements to the show that, for me personally, when I drank that Kool-Aid as a teenager in the early 2000s and, sang along to the show, there were a lot of themes that I kind of completely glossed over. But the realness to the stakes of the show for the characters in it and kind of where they were coming from felt very real in the climate against the backdrop. So I think a lot of things.
So that we were thinking that this reckoning with COVID, but Jim and I were talking also about how the political climate has affected all of you in your work, and you're really working currently in this art form. And I think the reckoning of like what you said, Tom, about never finally realizing you had never done a play by a Black author or playwright. So many theaters are going through that and trying to rectify that. And I personally, I really admire it. And I'm hoping that this effort, but that coupled with the political climate that we're in, how that has affected your work as well. I mean, all of this, this perfect storm of everything happening at once.
Yeah, I'll try to tackle a response there. I mentioned that there's been all these historical shutdowns through the history of the theater, and every time it comes back, and I said, and hopefully it comes back better. And that's literally what I was talking about. That's the subtext of what that statement was.
Mm-hmm.
If we rebuild a theater industry that is no better than the one that closed down in March 2020, then this entire thing has been nothing but a colossal waste of everybody's time.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility to make what we do more ethical. And if we can't do that, then we don't deserve the form. That's sort of where I am. We have a responsibility to make an industry that is less toxic. We have a responsibility to make an industry that is genuinely inclusive, not just making nods towards inclusion. We have a responsibility to make an industry that is no longer, I'm sorry, I'm on a soapbox now, that is no longer inhospitable to parents.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how many people, particularly how many women, have left the theater industry because there's no way to do it and raise children. I can think of so many that I know. This pause, this intermission, this whatever we want to call it, has to be the moment where we look at the conversations that are going on in the world around us and recognize that the world is much richer than we thought it was, and we have to build a form that encompasses that. Okay, end rant.
We had an interesting at the ONeill, sort of an interesting sort of way of looking at or view of the kind of reckoning that's going on in the world, in that the ONeill has always had everything that has been on their stage has often been very, very diverse. They've supported, August Wilson and David Henry Hwang and all of these other, playwrights that have come through there. And interestingly, when we took the work away, we had to look at the rest of the organization. And was that reflective of the culture? Was that the theater that we wanted to have? Was that the level of diversity that should be reflected in the American theater, in the American theater canon? So, I started this job in August of 2020. So I came in when there was no work on the stage. So I couldn't even really sort of look at the organization from the point of view of the work. I had to look at the kind of organization in terms of its overall mission and how that's reflected in the things other than the work. In our education, in our faculty, in our choices of organizational structure, hiring practices. So, I was sort of looking at it from, this completely other level that didn't have as much to do with what was on the stage, but what supports what's on stage. So that was been kind of an interesting way into the conversation that's been going on in the theatrical community, to actually have to come at it from a point of view that had really nothing to do with the work, because the work had been taken away.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think you both touched on the programming and the outward facing and the external messaging.
Mm-hmm.
That is essential. If you are not adapting to that, similar to Tom says, you misunderstood the assignment. Like, I don't want to see what you're doing. And that is kind of an area where theaters have the highest level of accountability, because that is what the outside sees. But it is really a structural development from the inside out. And you need to kind of shine the mirror within the organization and see where the blind spots are, where the growth areas are, what is lacking. Listen to people that maybe have not otherwise felt like they had a platform to share their experience, that may be different than, that of those in leadership positions, and to kind of collectively identify the systemic problems and to kind of work together to create a road path forward that is equitable and inclusive, and representative of the world we live in and the world we want to create.
Well, and that that reminds me of something that I saw nearly every day for several years, and I'm gonna have to paraphrase it, but there was a quotation on the wall of your classroom, Terry, from James Earl Jones about something to the effect of, if mankind's the first order to look back on itself, then the theater is its reflector.
Well done, Scott.
That framing has stuck with me. You know, I graduated a number of years ago, but I could still see that corner of that board, and that line about the theater is the reflector of society is true. And so we need to reflect well.
I also think it's, you know, as companies are adapting and making more conscious choices with their programming to bring stories to their stages that may not have been shared before, and you're bringing in new artists that may have not been included within your theater's community before, as a producer, as a theater, you have an obligation to set them up for success. And really making sure that you're creating earnest avenues for feedback and development and support, and creating the tools in which everyone can succeed and communicate with each other throughout the process, I think is essential. One of the things we did, and it's not so specific to the work of kind of racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, but coming back on this season, we brought in a resident intimacy coordinator. And they work on every show. She's fantastic, and she has a company, and she, you know, fosters the development of that field. And, you know, there are shows where she serves as a choreographer. There's, you know, a need to choreograph moments of intimacy, and to have somebody who's trained in that field to make sure that the room is being respectful and generating a kind of consent-based energy is important. But she also sits every cast down and on the first day and talks about tools and resources to talk about setting boundaries and identifying needs in a way that is respectful. Has been that's just one small change that I think, you know, is ever evolving, but has been kind of a path forward in terms of creating tools and resources for everyone so that they can not only be successful, but you know, feel empowered to say, pause, I need more in this moment, or this didn't work for me, and we can kind of adapt and respond to that.
You guys are talking a lot about new works and the need to draw in, you know, new playwrights and with new themes and so on. How does that balance with trying to do established work? How do you fit in established work with this need to be reflective of the world that we're in and be fair to all segments of society? Is it an either or is there a way that they can both be integrated? Does that make sense? You understand?
Yeah, it shouldn't have to be an either or, I don't think. I mean, we focus mostly on new work at the ONeill, but certainly our students look at new work and classic work side by side, and, you know, do different things with new, you know, with you know, devising from old pieces, or, you know, reimagining pieces. And a lot of times, especially in a student environment, you do what you can with what you have to work with, right? You have students that don't necessarily always reflect exactly the piece that that you have in your curriculum, but you know, bring all of these voices together to sort of have a new understanding of the work based on the folks that are interacting with it.
I think, and again, I come at this from the perspective of someone who teaches theater history. But I think we have to, when we engage with those classics, we have to engage with them honestly and recognize the many ways in which they're deeply flawed, at least by the ethics of our current time period. I'll use an example from literally last week. I'm teaching theater history right now, and last week we started with the Greeks, and we're reading Aeschylus's classic play Agamemnon, and it's a really sexist play. Contemporary students don't initially read it that way. because they read the central character of Clytemnestra, and they used a phrase to describe her that I can't say on a family podcast. But they, they think she's a boss. But that's not what Aeschylus thought of her. So what I use that play to do is to, one, talk about the difference in audience reception from original to now, but also to talk about what do we do with these messy plays from the past? How do we read this play through the lens of a feminist perspective?
Mhm.
How do we read Othello through the lens of race? How do we actually engage with these classic texts through a modern lens? And then once we've done that work, have the real conversation. Is this a play that we want on our stages anymore? And if the answer to that is yes, how are we going to address the problems within that script? Because you can't pretend that they're not there. I tell my students there's no such thing as a neutral image on stage. Every image on stage has got meaning, whether you want it to or not. So you better engage with it.
Yeah, I think, to answer your question, I think it really just comes down to what is most exciting to see and what is most exciting to do. And I think, largely, probably speaking just from my own wants and needs for what I want to see on theater, I'm more drawn to hearing new voices in this moment and to creating spaces for new playwrights and new developments and whatnot. But to Tiffany's point, I don't think the two need to be mutually exclusive. I think if there is a classic piece and, the director or the producers have a clear vision in terms of why that show is important to be putting it on their stages now and what they're going to do with it and how they're going to, do justice to the piece through the lens of, equity and fairness and have currency to it and relevance, I'd love to see that. So, I think it is really about what is called for in this moment and what is most exciting to see and to be doing.
Mhm.
There is a I don't know if it's a trend. I think it's been around too long to be a trend, but it's a movement maybe in opera, much more, I think, than in the kind of theater that you guys deal with, that is causing a lot of anxiety and anger and all kinds of response from people. And it's Reggie Theater, which is the director kind of taking charge, not just of the production and the shape of the telling of the story, but in some cases rewriting the story, reorganizing music, making an ending that's more agreeable to his or her idea of what that opera should be about. And as you can imagine, in a conservative world like opera, it's the source of many editorials, letters to magazines. I don't know if that's something you guys have experienced or have to deal with, but do you have any thoughts on that or responses to what that might mean for you? Or do you not? You don't have to engage with this idea, probably.
I mean, I think there's an element of honoring the playwright and what is intended. And, if you want to rewrite a story, write your own story to a degree, right?
Right.
It's like, this is not your text to rewrite. Like, if you have a story you want to tell, go create it and feel empowered to do so. And I think a lot of my company and the work I work on producing is largely contemporary to a point that it's not an open domain, and you cannot take a show that you license and change the text to it. So I think that's a lot of my discipline in terms of how I look at that situation. With opera, there are a lot, and Shakespeare, there's a lot of pieces that are old enough that they are open domain, and there's no restrictions in editing that. So I think when done tastefully, I think there can be a space for it. But
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
And for us, it's been mostly in our education programs in trying to, I think a lot of what Tom said kind of resonates with me, that taking pieces that perhaps aren't, they're not really made for a modern time and don't have a very modern point of view, and the comfort or discomfort with using certain terms that are written on the page or speaking in a certain way because that's how the playwright wrote it. I came from the school of you never change a word that an author has put on the page. But that comes into question quite often in a classroom and has been a source of a lot of discussion over the course of the last 18 months that I've been in my job. What's appropriate to say, what's appropriate to give warnings about, what's appropriate to discuss as a group. At what point do you stop before saying something? What can a teacher say in a class? What can a teacher read off of a page? And it has been an uncomfortable conversation, discussion, twisting and turning of everyone's comfort level with making adjustments to work that we know that certainly in my time I would have been like, well, that's what's on the page, but now we have to think about differently and think about more critically, and we always should have thought about it critically, and I think we did. It's just that the guidelines were much more stringent, I think, than they they're much more fluid now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I come from a similar place of I've always been told respect the text. Yeah. On the page, you can't change a word. And I've done enough work with new play development that it's important.
Yeah.
Comma, space, but then there's times that, I don't want that said. And I really don't want that said by a student who's learning in a learning environment. But where we also sometimes run into issues is, I suspect if Signature calls a rights holder with a question about, hey, we'd like to change these 3 words, Signature's going to get a response more quickly than a small university is. And sometimes we don't get a response at all when we ask. And then you're stuck with what is the ethical choice of what to do here? And that's a hard place to be, particularly when you're working with young people and the primary goal is to teach and cause no damage.
Yeah, I think that looking at classic works through a modern lens is something that a lot of educators are talking about now, and you can't project what the playwright, what Moliere intended necessarily, but can we take this very rich story and find a way of placing it in an environment or in a world that's going to speak to contemporary. And I think that's one thing I really like about curating for students, Tom, like finding those pieces for students and talking about, for instance, in Time Your Life, which you remember way back when, takes place in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. And there was a rich, rich community of trans artists and trans people. Should we bring that play back and create a world where those voices can be heard through that play? I don't know, but I think thinking about it is really exciting, and I'm glad that nobody here is saying throw the classics out, because we don't want to do that at all. And what makes them classic, hopefully, is that you can look at Agamemnon and Clytemnestra with your students and find ways for it to speak to them. So where I am interested in training as well, Jim and I talked about that, the difference in, like, when I went to school for theater, there was this, it was like in the 70s, so you stripped the actor down and you tore them apart and and I think times have changed, right? So how do we nurture the artistry, performance artistry? And I I'd love to hear from where you guys are at with that, what you think is important in this day.
One of the things I often say is that I want to train students both for the industry as it exists, but also to make the industry that they deserve. So I want them to know what the rules of the road are, but I also want them to know where those rules are nonsense, and to start giving them the tools to go and affect change. I wish I could say that school of we're going to tear the actor down had completely gone away. It hasn't. It still exists in pockets. I don't recommend those programs. I think they're really damaging, but there are still people who do it. We continue to be at this inflection point of how do we want to train people to enter this industry? I think we've recognized many of the ways that things were toxic. I have a very vivid memory of watching someone do a teaching demonstration for an acting class several years ago, where he gave a private coaching to one actor to surprise his scene partner and grab her. And as soon as I saw that, I went, well, nope, that's a bad idea. We should be teaching acting, because that's something that would have been really normal.
Oh,
in
yeah.
a previous moment, but we've had all sorts of new conversations about consent. Laura, to go back to the intimacy direction, I know who your intimacy director is. Have these conversations about consent, because that's where the industry is going, and we need to do the proper way to do it.
I think there's something exciting about the unknown. I think there was so much of kind of a rote system of how the industry functioned, and it was kind of a machine that just kept spinning, and you were a student and you got out into the real world and you kind of tried to just jump into the hoop prior to the pandemic. And now, as we are in kind of this new chapter for theater, theater is still figuring out what theater is and what the guidelines are and what the standards are. And, there were a lot of goals set in the shutdown when nothing was happening that look good on paper that don't quite pan out in practice. And so, as everyone is moving forward, they're recalibrating. So this idea, looking at the classes of students that are, about to graduate and get into the world, the idea of preparing them for the industry, there is a big kind of question mark there in terms of what that is and how they fit into it. And I think, I can't speak to the training and what is being discussed, but in terms of those that are coming into the field right out of school, there are spaces at tables for them with their perspectives to be kind of folded into what this path forward is. And I think that's really exciting.
Tiffany, you got a last word for us on this?
I don't have a last word for you, but I was sitting there thinking just that, about learning the rules of the road and where to make changes. And I was thinking about voice lessons actually with Mr. Davis, and being told not to change a note until I knew them all.
You learn the rules so that you could break them.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah, very good.
Well, I have to say, I'm sorry, Terry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that as a teacher, I'm always inspired by students. And today, I just want to say that in my darker moments, I have a lot of pessimism about so many things in today's world. And this session has given me such a perspective of optimism. I mean, just hearing you guys talk is just such a tonic, and it just makes me feel so good.
That's exactly what I was going to say. The exact same thing. I feel like, and of course, Jim and I have always said great minds, but it does give me hope, and I feel
no question.
You are so thoughtful, and you have, you're all of your hearts and minds are in exactly the right place for this, to move forward. It is exciting to think of, like Laura said. So I'm happy to feel the optimism, the precious energy, as Laura noted. So Jody, what have we got? Time of your life.
Yay!
Is that your script? From you're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
I'm so stupid. Sorry. This is my time of your life script from freshman year of high school with you. Still on my bookshelf back there.
I went to the
lines
one.
highlighted.
Oh, that
I
is
love that. And I can't show it because my laptop will fall down, but my computer is currently propped up with my Riverside Complete Works of William Shakespeare. And I think the Bedford Guide to Drama are my two laptop ends today.
Yeah.
That's funny.
So thank you both for giving me a foundation to kind of go out.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
When I tell you,
Tiffany, I hope to read again. I love doing that.
Did you read this year? Did you?
I did.
You did? Oh, good. This season?
I think so. I finished them like in November.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Did you get good stuff this year? Oh, good.
I thought it was amazing. I don't know if any of them made it, but when you read for the ONeill, it's anonymous, so you don't know who wrote it or what they're. But one of the most interesting things I thought was that you ask the writers to ask their own questions about the work, which I thought was really cool and really fun. Anyway, we'll talk more.
It is neat. You will always read. Mr. Davis, you should do musicals for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.